let's talk about everything that I read in the month of September. Hello, my name is Emily Crow from the Cozy Crow, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today we are talking about everything that I read in the month of September and a little bonus of my TBR for the month of October. You can see I got this cute shirt from Piper and Ivy, haunted by my TBR. It's really cute. So I decided to wear it today because we are going to be talking about my October TBR at the end once I talk about all the books I read in September. And my stats tell some crazy stories, so I'm really excited to get into it. I got a new reading notebook because I had like an actual reading journal, but most of the pages in this was taken up by space for full reviews of books, and I don't do that physically. I just needed somewhere to write down the books I read and what I rated them on a 5-star scale. And so I got something a little different that I feel like is going to work better for me and be a better use of my space. So that's what this is. So for the month of September, I read a total of 15 books. Every single one of those books I read on audio, which is wild to me. And I think a lot of it was because anytime I read at bedtime, I was working on a specific ebook that I have not finished yet. And if you've been watching this channel, you probably know which one I'm talking about, Kingdom of Ash. But we'll talk about that later in my October TBR because I really want to finish that this month. But as far as September, all 15 books that I read were on audio, which is abnormal. Usually I have a couple books I read electronically, a couple books I've read physically, but not this month. It was all on audio. And when we look at all the books on my physical TBR and how many I was able to work through and put on my completed bookshelf, I read 11 books from my physical TBR. So that means I only read 4 books that were not on my physical TBR shelf. So pretty good. I'm working through my physical TBR slowly but surely. And right now my mood is just to read books that I already have. There's a lot of new books coming out that I know I want to purchase, and so those will probably go straight on my physical TBR. And so I don't think I'm gonna get through a lot of library books that I wasn't sure I want to read. I tend to purchase books I am pretty positive I'm going to like, and so I'm just in the mood to read those books that I have really high hopes for. And I think that's the shift that I'm going into towards the end of this year, because I have a lot on my physical TBR that I would love to get to, and I still use the library to get through a lot of those reads. If we want to break down the genres of books that I read 4 romances, 1 sci-fi, I read 7 fantasy novels, I read 1 thriller-ish, and I actually read 2 nonfiction books, which is a little abnormal for me. I don't read a lot of nonfiction, but I read 2 this month. The longest book that I read was House of Earth and Blood by Sarah J. Maas. This is the first Crescent City book, and it is 800 pages, $799 right in there. And then the shortest book I read was a novella called Daimon, and it is like a prequel novella to the Covenant series by Jennifer L. Armentrout, and that is only 62 pages long. I definitely see myself reading some more novellas in the month of October though. And then finally, if we want to break down when these books were published originally and when I read them, I read 3 books published this year in 2024. I read 3 books published in 2023. I read 4 books that were published in the early 2020s, 4 books published in the 2010s, and then I read 1 book that was published in the 2000s. And that was my oldest book that I read this month, and it was published in 2005. The book that was published in 2005 was Never Let Me Go by Kazoo Ishiguro. I like this spread. It's more spread out and varied than some months, so that's kind of fun to read. Though I don't read a lot of older books because I have so many newer books that I have on my backlist to get through, and then maybe eventually I will work my way backwards in time. If there are any specific stats that you want to know, let me know down below and I can answer your questions, and I can also make sure to include those stats in future book videos. So just let me know if there's anything that you want to hear more about. My hair's a little wet. I had a shower today, so you might notice it drying throughout this video. You'll also notice that I am in my office craft room instead of near my bookshelf, and that's because my daughter's home today and she's downstairs watching her TV, having some screen time, and so I am in a different area of the house. And I've got my stack of books. Oh my gosh, it's so heavy. So let's jump right into the books that I read in September. The first book that I finished in the month of September was The Match by Sarah Adams, and this is one of her backlist books that she had self-published and was being republished by Dell, as she was picked up a couple series ago, and so now she's going back and republishing and expanding on her earlier novels. It's been really fun to go through her backlist, and I have been keeping up on these new re-releases, so you should definitely see more coming up in the coming months. And this one was the first one that was republished. This is about someone with epilepsy who has a service dog and works as her passion for a service dog training company that matches people with service dogs. And the male main character is the father of a little girl who was, I think, maybe 10, and she has epilepsy. And he is convinced, against his will, basically, to get a service dog for his daughter so that she can have more security and more confidence in navigating life with this disability and kind of getting back to a new routine and feeling safe to do so. I liked how this book had some disability representation, and I really liked the integration of like the service dog and how that process goes. I felt like it was really realistic, and if you read the author's note in the back, you can tell that Sarah Adams has a personal connection to service dogs and navigating those disabilities from, I think, a member of her family, maybe? I can't quite remember. But I really liked that aspect of the story. This was not my favorite of hers. I rated it a 3.5 star. She's kind of a cheesy romance writer, which is fine. In some cases, I really like that. But in this book, it felt a little bit immature. The miscommunication between these characters, like they kept defining their relationship, doing the DTR conversation. Then immediately afterwards, they would second guess what they literally just talked about and how the other person actually felt. And that was kind of frustrating because it's like you're having these conversations that are good and important and you're setting boundaries and whatnot, and then you're second guessing it immediately after. And so that was kind of frustrating. I also felt like these characters, they both had reasons why this felt like a new thing to get into a serious relationship, but I wasn't really convinced at their hesitation. It felt kind of like this was their first serious relationship, end of high school, beginning of college, even though one of the characters is in their 30s and the other one is mid-20s. And so it just felt a little bit immature in that sense. I also found that their chemistry, I wasn't totally on board with. It felt very insta-lovey. Like I could see how things could progress, but just the timeline and the kind of interactions that we saw, it just wasn't super convincing. I would have loved a little bit more depth and time spent on developing their relationship, but not a bad story, just pretty shallow as far as a romance goes, just a cutesy read, not a lot of depth to it. The next book that I read, I don't have a physical copy of, and I'm actually kind of glad I have not purchased a physical copy of this. I heard good things about this. It's kind of a classic, and I didn't necessarily enjoy it. It just felt flat in a lot of ways, and this is Never Let Me Go by Kazoo Ishiguro, and I rated this book a 3-star. It's considered a sci-fi in a pseudo-nowadays type period. In this society, is this a big reveal? I feel like it's not that big of a reveal because it's really obvious reading the back cover, even though it's not stated outright, and it's very obvious throughout the entire book what's going on. If you don't want to know, I'm saying it now. There are clones that are harvested for vital organs, human clones. Back to the program if you didn't want any spoilers. It just felt like they were trying to be really subtle at like what's happening, and it was very obvious very early on in the book what was happening. And even though I kept getting little nudges that there's going to be bigger reveals, that you'll find out more that's going on, that never happened. And I felt like I didn't get anything out of reading this book necessarily. Like I was hoping for more information on like why the government was making these decisions, why these specific people were chosen. I just had a lot of questions that were never answered, and everything that the book ended up revealing were things that I figured out very early on my own. And when we're talking about a sci-fi novel or like a pseudo-dystopian novel, I want a lot more backstory and I want more details, and especially if there's like science going on, I want to know more, and I didn't really get that. This wasn't necessarily a bad book, but it just was very lackluster for me. A lot of people consider this a classic. I think it might be on the New York Times list of like 100 books you should read that recently came out. I see how there are lots of themes in here that talk a lot about our transforming world and the way that we interact with it, but it didn't hit me very hard. It felt very flat. This author I don't think is a great author for me. I read another book of theirs, The Remains of the Day, I think it's called, the one about the butler in England, as the world is changing and butlers are not needed as much and his role is changing. And I feel like this like slice of life minutia of thought told in a series of memories, at least the way that this author does it, is not a good fit for me and what I want from a book, especially one that's speculative, because I do enjoy speculative fiction, and I think this would fall more in that category than in a sci-fi or dystopian category, and I just didn't really connect with the way this author did it. But I know some people really enjoyed this book, and so I definitely recommend you give it a try, because there are some important themes and ponderings in this book, but it wasn't a great fit for me. The next book that I read is the final in this series. I am really in the mood to finish some series I've been working on, and this is Business Casual by B.K. Borison. This is the fall book in the Love Light Farms quadruplet? The series. It's the fall book. It's the final book, and this one involves Charlie, who is it Stella? The main farm owner's half-brother is Charlie, and then Nova is Beckett's sister. I, in general, really like this book. I rated it a 4.25 star. It definitely wasn't my favorite of this series, but it definitely wasn't my least favorite either. I really liked these two characters, and I really liked getting to know them on a deeper level, because both of them kind of have a personality that they portray first and foremost, and then you get to dive deeper. I do wish that we saw more of Charlie's portrayed persona, because he is a very loud and proud character in the other books, and I just didn't see that as much in here, and I would have loved to see more of that side of him so that I could connect this version of him with what we see in the other books. It felt a little weak in that aspect. I also felt a little bit annoyed at their like miscommunication in this book, because it felt like anytime they had issues or struggles in the relationship, they resolved really, really quickly, and so they didn't hold as much weight. So it was just kind of like an annoying little like side quest that we went on, their miscommunication. I guess I just don't appreciate more immature perspectives on relationships and dating. I like that they were willing to just kind of see what was happening and be casual about it. I think that you have a right to your choices as far as like what you want from a relationship, but it felt like when things were getting serious, they acted kind of immature about like how to address that when they noticed they were developing feelings. I don't know, I guess I just didn't connect with that aspect of their relationship growth as much, but I did really like this story. I do really like these characters, and in general, I'm really happy with how things turned out. The next book I read was also part of a series, and this is the fourth and final book of the series, though another series about a generation later has just come out from this author, and this is A Sky Beyond the Storm by Tahir, and Air just came out, so I did purchase my copy. I'm really excited to read it. This is the fourth book in the An Ember in the Ashes series, and this series is emotionally fraught. It's heartbreaking but heartwarming. You get so invested and connected with these characters. This was my least favorite of the series. I still rated it a 4.5 star because I did really, really love it, and I love these characters, and I loved some of the twists that we had and some of the conclusions of things. But considering how much political turmoil and rebellion and things that go on in this book, the way that this wrapped up was like a little bit too nice, if that makes sense. I think the thing that bothered me was there was like this big battle leading up to this huge climax, and then the resolution of this conflict was just not as intricate, intense, anticlimactic. The climax was anticlimactic because it was like a really easy resolution to all of the struggle that you see in this book. And as far as all the subplots go, there were still definitely some twists and turns and some strife and some things that didn't work out quite right. But as far as like the main plot, I wasn't as satisfied with the way that it ended because it felt too easy. So this was my least favorite of the series. I think maybe number 3 might have been my favorite, or number 2. I rated the first, second, and third all 5 stars. This one just felt a little bit flat for me, but it does have a very neat bow on the ending for most of these characters. There's definitely some sorrow and heartbreak at the end too. So it wasn't totally mismatched, but it felt a little bit not as satisfying as I was hoping for. The next book that I read was one that I had started on audio from my library, and then I really enjoyed it so much I binged it and I bought the whole rest of the series. This book is from the Covenant series by Jennifer L. Armentrout, and this came out early 2010s. And they just recently came out with new covers that are actually really, really cool and kind of moody. And they all have sprayed edges. Each one in the series has a different color, which is just like really fun. So I had seen this book. It had caught my eye. I was really intrigued. But as far as like YA stories go, I wasn't sure if I would love this. And so I got it from Libby first, and I really enjoyed it. And this is no literary marvel, but super bingeable and just having a really good time. And it throws me back to when I was like in middle school, high school, and I would have devoured this. So I am really enjoying it and I'm unapologetic about it. This is Half-Blood. This is the first book in the series, and inside this you actually have a novella that I read afterwards as a prequel novella, but I didn't realize I had the physical copy in here until after I had finished the audiobook copy. So we'll get to that in a minute. But as far as the actual novel that's in here, this is Half-Blood. I rated it a 4-star. It's super easy to binge. It's a really fast read because it is YA, and it's just written in a very easy to read way. This is my very first Jennifer L. Armentrout book, and I don't think it'll be my last, so I'm not sure if I will like her adult books. I don't know if they'll be like too spicy for me. I don't know, but I need to try some more from her after I finish this series. This series is about descendants of Greek gods living in our world. Hey Georgia, what's up? My daughter has not been contained, so we shall see how fast we can get through the rest of this. Half-Blood. This is about the descendants of some Greek gods in a low fantasy world, just like ours. It takes place in, I think, mostly Nashville type area, or like Georgia island off the coast of the southeast United States. And basically there are purebloods who are direct descendants of the gods and their direct descendants, and then half-bloods who are a mixture of a pure and a mortal. The half-bloods are an inferior class of people, but they have a special ability that they can see through the glamours the demons have, whereas purebloods can't see through those glamours. This society that's hidden inside our world is training half-bloods to be guards for the purebloods, or to be sentinels and to go attack the demons that are around. Though demon is spelled D-A-I-M-O-N, which drives me bonkers. But in the audiobooks, it's pronounced demon. So we're talking about Alex, who is a half-blood, and her mother took her away from this society to protect her. And throughout this book, you find out why Alex needed protecting from the society a little bit, what was in store for her, and you learn more about her and her relationships. It's definitely romantic-y. Her relationships with Aiden, who is a pureblood who's training her, kind of getting her up to speed with the Covenant and the things that she should be learning at this stage in her training, since she took a few years off when her mother snuck her away. You have some strife because her mother was killed by demons, so she really wants to avenge her mother's death, but then, you know, secrets come out, there's plot twists, yada yada. Anyway, very bingeable, very easy to read, and I enjoyed this. 4-star. Though I really wish that there was more conversation about this inferior class of people, because there's a lot of parallels that can be drawn with like racial segregation and discrimination, etc. And I don't think Jennifer L. Armentrout is a BIPOC writer, but there's some conversations you can have about some of these topics, and I kind of wish that she had delved deeper or made things a little bit more serious, but this is a very fluffy read. The next book that I read is All In by Jennifer Lynn Barnes. Lots of Jennifer writers. And this is the third book in the Natural series, and this is one that I've enjoyed, but not enough that I think I'll purchase it. It's just a little bit more immature, and the first couple books focus heavily on this love triangle that wasn't my favorite. This book, however, did not focus on the love triangle as much, which I really liked. I rated this a 4.5 star. This is my favorite so far in the series. And in this book, these teenagers who have special abilities and are tasked by the FBI to help solve cold cases and recently more active cases that the FBI is undertaking. They go to Las Vegas to investigate some murders, and they find out some really interesting things about like the Fibonacci sequence and like predicting where and when the murders will happen. And it's just really intricate and very interesting, and you get some huge bombshell truths dropped about where the story is going, and there's some like cult involvement and stuff. So this book really leads into a much bigger picture on some horrible serial killers and whatnot. So it's just really fascinating, and it was just a really intriguing read, more so than the other books in the series that I still enjoyed, but this one is definitely my favorite. You might hear my daughter playing upstairs. So sorry. But the next book that I listened to was Daimon, which is, again, the novella that is at the beginning of this book. And it is the prequel. It's everything that happens to Alex before she gets rescued by the Sentinels and taken back to the Covenant. So you hear about her mother and how her mother was killed by the demons, etc., etc. I didn't like this as much. I rated it a 3.5 star. I mean, this is an easy to read series, but this novella felt very fluffy. Like, it didn't really add anything to the characterization. It didn't really give us any more background or details on the story besides what we hear in Half-Blood itself. So it didn't really feel necessary, honestly, but there's no point not reading it because it's so short. Yeah, it just didn't really add anything. Whereas I feel like if there's a prequel story, you should be learning more about the characters or their backstory, or maybe getting little nods to some secrets that you'll learn later on in the series. It didn't really give me any of that. Maybe that's just my experience, but it was fine. My daughter's now under the stairs in the little clubhouse area, so you might hear her even more. I'm so sorry. This has been derailed, but I am already halfway through the video, so I'm gonna keep going. I'm so sorry for all the interruptions. This is driving me bonkers. It's hard. Film on a day when my daughter's home, but this is the time I have, and I don't want to be super far behind on this video because I'm switching to night shifts and can't film when there's no light. The next book that I read was Leigh Bardugo's The Familiar. Leigh Bardugo is definitely an auto-buy author for me. I've read all of her young adult novels and I really enjoyed them. Her adult books are definitely a different flavor, and this book is a historical fantasy with a strong romance subplot. And this takes place in the time of the Spanish Inquisition. There is a servant named Lucia who is just trying to make do. She's not perfect at all, but she's trying to, make enough money, have somewhere safe to be, etc., etc., hoping to one day improve her station. And she has a little bit of magic, and she just uses it for like little things like fixing burnt bread or making pails of water lighter, things like that. But her employers find out about her magic and show her off, and then her magic gets the attention of some prominent people during this time frame. Her new patron is trying to gain the favor of the king at this time through this magician saying that it's, milagritos, little miracles that are sent from God, etc., etc. And the thing with this time period is that there's a really thin line between like things that are from God and things that are from the devil. And you see some of that in this story as there's others that are competing to try and gain the king's favor as their miracle worker. There's some interesting elements of intrigue in here, and with the magic there's some fantasy that is really unexpected. Like the magic that you see, it's really interesting. And there's some interesting consequences to the magic. And then towards the end of the book, you hear a lot more about the political intrigue aspects of what's going on. And you'll see that this scorpion, it's a symbol for the main male character. What is his name? It's a symbol for the character Sanaa, who is the main male character of this book, and he ends up being the love interest. I rated this book a 4.25 star. If you liked Ninth House and that series, you'll enjoy the writing style and the vibes of this book. There was a moment, and it's so funny, but I was reading this book and I was like, wow, this is reminding me of Ninth House. And I was like, the way, like, this is the same author. Of course it should remind me. But the writing style, the way that the characters are portrayed, the vibes, it's all very similar. But the plots and storylines are very different and unique from Ninth House. So if you liked that writing style by Leigh Bardugo, you would enjoy this book as well, I feel like. I didn't enjoy the romance as much as I thought I would, because some people have talked about it. I just didn't feel the chemistry as much. I wanted a little bit more substance in their chemistry and how their relationship grew and progressed. I wasn't entirely convinced with the choices that they made in the name of love. Based on the relationship that I saw, I wanted a little bit more depth and weight to that relationship, if that makes sense. But it was a very intriguing story, and it opened my eyes a little bit to a period of time that I don't know a lot about. And so that was really refreshing and something new, and really good fall vibes too. The next book that I read was an unexpected 5-star, my only 5-star of the month, my favorite read of the month. And this is The Last Days of the Dinosaur by Riley Black. This is a nonfiction. I even tabbed it. Can you see that? Like, who am I? And I think that the best description of this book is by Steve Brusatte at the very front cover. It says, "This is pop science that reads like a fantasy novel but backed up by hard facts." This is a novelization of the science that we know behind the big impact that led to the extinction of the dinosaurs and other dinosaur-like creatures, and just totally changed the trajectory that our world was going on. By trajectory, I don't mean like the actual like trajectory in space, but I mean like trajectory of like creatures on Earth and the dominance of certain organisms, etc. That's the trajectory I mean. The trajectory of having us show up on the Earth as well. This book goes through not only like the day of the impact, like what life looked like for the dinosaurs around that time, also the immediate implications of the impact in the hours and even days after the impact, but also the long-term implications of like a month, a year, 100 years, 1,000 years, 1,000,000 years after this impact that happened 65 million years ago. It's fascinating. And this author painted such a beautiful picture of like what was happening. I really felt like I was there and I could really see what was going down. I was so impressed by how much this book made me feel for the dinosaurs and the other creatures and the suffering that they went through because of this extinction event. Like, I didn't quite understand the total implications of having such a meteor impact on the Earth, like what that did, like making the air 500 degrees Fahrenheit, like, and how that happened. Like, it just blew my mind what we can extrapolate from the science that we have on what the conditions were like and why certain creatures and plants survived and why many others did not. It blew my mind. This is a really great introductory if you don't know a ton about dinosaurs or a ton about this extinction event and you want to start dipping your toes in, because there's many times where you learn like critical truths about extinction and adaptation that these animals go through and evolution. Fascinating. And I really enjoyed it. It honestly made me think about God and that he also felt sorrow for the suffering that they went through, how small the margin was for these dinosaurs and other creatures to be destroyed and become extinct in order for a new era on the Earth. There's so many different scenarios that could have happened, and yet this scenario happened. There's so many different ways that this scenario could have happened, but with different long-term implications. And so it's just really fascinating to think about like the tight margin of this trajectory that the world took on because of this impact and everything that happened thereafter. And it was just really fascinating to hear about, how the flora and fauna of the world kind of shifted because of this. I loved it. It was fascinating. I also really like that Riley Black is a transgender author, and I need more diversity in my reading, and I would definitely read more from this author. I read this book and it made me want more in a good way, not feeling like I missed out that this book was lacking. This book was not lacking at all. It was exactly what it was intending to deliver, but it made me want more from this author. It made me want more from the dinosaurs and more about this extinction event and learning the impact it had on. So I feel like this is an amazing nonfiction that's really approachable for people who don't read a lot of nonfiction. If you feel like this sounds interesting to you, I highly recommend it. The next book that I read was The Unmaking of June Farrow by Adrienne Young. And I feel like I may have read one other book by her, but she's got quite the backlist. And most of her books that are on her backlist, I am intrigued about reading. Though reading this book, I didn't love it as much as other people have. I rated this a 3.5 star. I can't remember if I considered this a fantasy or not, but it's basically time travel, but it's like a domestic relationship type of story with some mysterious undertones. And it's all framed within this family curse that the women in this family can go to other time periods with some limitations. You don't get answers on why they can travel time like this. Is this a spoiler? This book involves some magical realism, I would say, with a magic door that takes June to another time period. You learn more about her family's curse and her mother's original disappearance and some historical discrepancies that she comes across. And you also learn about some relationships that she's had with people in a past that she can't remember. And so it was very interesting, a little bit convoluted like any kind of time travel-y type of story gets. And I just felt a little bit bored with this book. I anticipated a lot of the plot twists that were happening. I could see where the story was going. And it focused a lot more on like a speculative fiction vibe of family relationships and the shaping of the world and how things have been impacted by others' choices and things like that. But yeah, it felt a little boring to me. The conclusion was interesting, but also felt like it was kind of rushed, like the answers that you hope to get. I also felt like even though this is kind of historical, takes place in multiple timelines, that the historical scenes did not have any distinguishing features. So it could have been set in any time period. Like I spent half the book thinking I was in the 80s, even though I was in the 50s. And I wish that the author had taken more time to set the setting and create an atmosphere where you knew what time period you were in and you knew why it felt different to be in those scenes, if that makes sense. So not necessarily a bad book, but lots of ways I would have wanted the book to be different. And some people really, really love it. It just wasn't quite for me. So I'm a little sad that I have purchased the hardback version. I wish I had just the paperback. Since it took me long enough to read it, I could have just purchased paperback. The next book I read was also 3.5, and this is my other nonfiction of the month. This is The Art Thief by Michael Finkel, and look at these beautiful sprayed edges, and I don't know why there's a back. Like, I have no idea. They're really fun. This is another book that I wouldn't purchase it again if I had done the audiobook for my library first. But it wasn't necessarily a bad book, it just was lacking. This is about the most prolific art thief in Europe, and his name was Stefan Breitweiser. I can't remember how they pronounced it in the audiobook, but he pulled off more than 200 heists. His collection was worth an estimated $2 billion. And this was a really quick read, so it was really fun to do the audiobook for this. It is written by someone with a journalist background, and I feel like I wanted more from this story. I wanted more information about what happened to specific art pieces, more conclusion about those specific art pieces. I wanted more information about the implications of this art thief's actions on the art world in general, on security in museums maybe, on the impact of our society not ever getting some of those art pieces back. Things like that. I wanted more introspection. I wanted more extension of the story because it felt like it ended kind of abruptly. And considering it took like 10 years for this author to finally meet with Stefan himself, I feel like he could have spent a little bit more time on projecting the implications of these actions on the greater world. And I also wanted more conclusion about what is going on with Stefan, because he clearly has some mental health struggles. And there's a couple moments in this book where it's like, this psychologist says maybe he's a narcissist, or this psychologist says maybe he's got this random syndrome. It was always like a paragraph long, and we never got any conclusion about that. or any definitive like decisions about what is really going on in his head, because that is a really fascinating thing, because he's at least portrayed in this book as something different than other art thieves that we see. It was interesting, but not pulling me into the story so much, because it was missing a lot of the conclusions that I was hoping for from this book. The next book that I read was Rise and Divine by Lana Harper. This is the 5th and I heard final book of the Thistlegrove Witches series. This series has taken me on a long ride. I bought the first book and I enjoyed it. And then the second book, didn't enjoy as much. Kind of wish I hadn't bought the book. Third book, I really didn't like. Fourth book, I also didn't like. But this was the last book in the series. And I like the writing style of this author. And so I wanted to finish out the series. And this was a good book. I rated it 3.75 star. Oh, okay.
Yeah,
sure.
I'm just.
You can do that. You can do that. This book is a good conclusion to the series. You get little like glimpses of the other couples in the series, but really not a lot. It would have been nice for a little bit more of a conclusion of the story as a whole. I also really liked this plot, and it felt like it fit more with what was going on with the characters. Like, it didn't feel so out in left field, even though this plot ended up tying back to the crazy plots that we've seen in the past couple books really well. So that was a nice conclusion to hear that. You're following the female main character, Dasha. She is a devil eater. She's a demon eater. A devil eater is her special ability. You get to see the impact of this old god-like figure. It's really an interesting way that this all kind of ties together with Balsama, etc. I didn't really like this romance. I just feel like it was a minor plot compared to the actual plot of the story, and it was like a third chance romance, and we didn't get any of the depth or the gravity in the relationship, because they just skipped from we didn't work well together because XYZ to let's take another chance. And so you didn't get like what led them to each other. You just were serious feelings from the get-go. It was an interesting dynamic that I didn't love as much, but this was a solid end to a series that I had some love-hate feelings about. The next book that I read is a massive one, and this is House of Earth and Blood by Sarah J. Maas, the first in the Crescent City series. I read this for Uranaceous Fibers book box, and that video is coming out pretty soon. I made it through this 800-page book. I did the graphic audio, which was a really cool experience, and I talk about it more in my vlog about the Uranaceous Fibers book box. It changed the wording sometimes, but mostly it just had different sound effects or different effects on the voices that made it a lot more varied and a lot more interesting of a read. This is an urban fantasy that takes place in Crescent City, Lunathion, I think it's how it's pronounced. And you follow the character of Bryce Quinlan, who is a half-fae, and she's a party girl that something horrible happens to her best friend. And you fast forward 2 years later and see how she's just kind of stagnant, trying not to relive the trauma. And someone comes up to her and wants her help in trying to figure out what happened 2 years ago. So there's this mystery going on with multiple elements. You definitely get some red herrings, which caught me off guard because I had some weird vibes about certain characters, and my thoughts and feelings were like turned on their head, which was really interesting. It kept me stringing along. The last like 150 pages of this book were wild, so emotional. I literally cried. There was a lot of ups and downs and chaos. It was just a wild ride, and I really enjoyed it. I'm not necessarily an urban fantasy kind of person, and this book felt very strange to be in such a high fantasy world where they talked about like the university and they talked about cell phones and things like that, but there was like dozens of types of creatures in this world and different magics going on, and lots of new terms for things that are relatable to our society but different. It was just a really interesting type of an urban fantasy, and I would say like my only issue is the beginning. It's interesting because there's a lot of information, but the way that the information is presented, some people find it info dumpy or like kind of hard to wrap their brain around or to get into it. I feel like that information was dropped in such a casual way that it didn't really click in my brain. but it was okay because I was focusing more on the characters and their relationships, and the information that you hear about at the beginning of the book was also sprinkled throughout. You got the hang of what was going on, even if earlier you only got the gist of it. And so that was kind of interesting, and I don't know how much of that was intentional. It meant that a lot of the deeper concepts we didn't understand super early on, just the way that the writing was. It made it easy to like jump in, and if you just keep going without worrying too much about all the info dumping, that you will still know what's going on mostly, and all the other things will get looped back around to you. So that was kind of an interesting fantasy read. It made it much more easy to read than I was anticipating. I just am not like a super fan of urban fantasy, and so this wasn't my perfect style of read for me, but I still rated it a 4.75 star because it was still really fun and really intriguing. And you'll hear more about this in my vlog video coming up soon. The penultimate book that I read was the next in the Covenant series. This is Pure, and it's got these beautiful teal sprayed edges. I love it. And this book follows Alex and Aiden and Seth, who you meet in the first book, and you see a lot more relationship stuff going on. There's a love triangle for sure, and forbidden love, but also there's some drama. And you definitely get a good chunk of plot in here too, but this book leans a little bit more towards the relationship side of things, and I really like how you see growth in these characters, but it's like slow and steady growth, and so I'm really excited to see the character arcs throughout this entire series. I also really like that you learn a ton more about Seth, and you really get to see his character and gain an appreciation for him, as Alex is also gaining an appreciation for him as a person. You get some plot twists. I rated this a 3.75 star. I'm not as much here for the relationship stuff. I'm more here for the plot, and it was more relationship heavy. But also, there was a moment where a significant side character died tragically. And even though in the first book, you get a lot of grief and tragedy from Alex and her mother dying, in this book you don't get as much of that. Like, you don't see the impact long term of that. So like the emotional gravitas of that character dying was not as significant as I had hoped it would be. Still very bingeable, easy read. I literally listened to it over the course of a day, and I'm excited to get into the third one. There's 5 books in the series in total, and I think there's 2 novellas. We are kind of in the thick of things. The last book that I read in the month of September was my least favorite of the month, and this one is actually The Pumpkin Spice Cafe by Laurie Gilmore. I was on the lookout for this book. I had heard about this book, I think last year, and so it was kind of on my radar, but I don't necessarily go out of my way to find like independently published books. And so it was just kind of in the back of my mind. I saw online that it was stocked at a local bookstore of mine. So I was like, okay, cool. Maybe I'll grab it because it looks like a fun fall read. I went, it was out of stock. Next time I go to a different store, I'll check. Also out of stock. It was out of stock at like 4 different bookstores that I went to. Wild. So I ended up purchasing it from Amazon, and I got this cool foil version, which is really fun. I am not happy with this book. I will say it has some fall vibes. It is a small town romance. It is almost 400 pages, but the type is so huge. It was a 7-hour listen. So at 2 times speed, it was a 3.5-hour listen. So I read it in a morning while I was like doing chores and stuff. The characters are really flat and one-dimensional. There's some lines that actually made me laugh out loud, but a lot of times they were just like cheesy and awkward, but not in a realistic way that's like relatable, more in like a, what is this writer writing about? Like, this doesn't feel realistic. It just feels clunky. Yeah, I felt clunky. Their relationship was very insta-lovey. I didn't really feel the chemistry. And this book is fall vibes, wholesome, pumpkin spice cafe, small town, and the characters themselves were presented really wholesome in one note, and then they would like think about spicy things they could do to each other. Or there was a couple actual spicy scenes in here, and it just felt really incongruent with the vibes of the rest of the book and the vibes of the characters themselves. It just felt a little bit weird. I wasn't a huge fan, but I didn't rate it super poorly because it was a really fast read. And so again, there's not a lot of depth, and there were some moments that made me laugh that didn't seem ironic. Maybe were intended to make me laugh, but it was kind of cringy and just a little bit off. Like, I could tell that this had been traditionally published only because it was becoming popular, but it wasn't necessarily a great read. And in my research, it looked like the next book, which is The Cinnamon Bun Bookstore, is very similar. Oh, another thing, this has a mystery in it that has a limited list of suspects and limited possible motivations. It's very clear what's going on from the very beginning, and the characters are just really stupid in trying to figure out, and then they're like, oh, we finally confronted so-and-so, figured out the mystery, and it wasn't a big deal. Maybe 2.75 is too high. I don't know. I would not recommend this book. There are many other books that have more writing quality to them that also have fall vibes. So not one I would recommend, but some people really like this easy, cheesy read. I did not. Hopefully we can get through a really quick October TBR. Oh no. Ah! Oh my gosh. Ah! Okay, first I want to talk about all the books I'm currently reading. This one, I honestly might DNF, because it's just not holding my interest. This is Not Just Jane by Shelley Deweese, and it's about 7 authors that are contemporaries to Jane Austen and like the impact they had on literature at the time, even if they're not very common right now. I thought this would be an interesting read, but it's not really intriguing me as much as I thought it would. For the amount of words in this book, it's not giving me a lot of information or interest, so I might DNF it, which I don't want to do because I want to be a literary person, but it just might not be worth my time. But some books I am enjoying and reading: Till There Was You by Lindsay Hammeroff. I'm finally reading this. I am maybe 50 pages in. This is my current ebook that I am working through. I've got it from my library, and I'm really enjoying having a romance as an ebook to read. It's a good vibe for right before bed. And basically, this girl, she's working hard in culinary school. She wants to be a Michelin star chef, and she meets this guy, happenstance kind of thing, is trying to break out in the music world, and they spend like a weekend together, one night stand turned weekend thing, and they start to really connect. She makes him some blueberry pancakes, and per the back cover, it sounds like he writes a song about her blueberry pancakes, and he makes it big, and you see how their relationship how they navigate these big changes in their relationship to one another, and how that impacts their personal lives and decisions. And I really don't know what's gonna happen, but I'm really intrigued, and this is a beautiful cover. I've been meaning to read it for a while. And then the other book that I'm reading, Kingdom of Ash by Sarah J. Maas. I've got maybe like 350 pages left. I'm making really good progress, honestly. I just have a lot of library books that I am prioritizing, and then whenever I feel like switching to something different, I will listen to the audiobook of this, or if I'm wanting to read something different, I'll switch to the ebook of this, because I've got the Audible and Kindle versions that kind of communicate with one another, and so that's been really nice to change the pace. But this is a 1,000-page book, so it's taking a lot. So those are the books I'm currently reading. I really hope to finish them or DNF them in this next month. Other October reads, I did post a video about my 10 books on my physical TBR I hope to read this month, but I have one more to share with you, and I'm just going to run through all of them really quick. So this is a new book I just bought. This is Graveyard Shift. This is by M.L. Rio. This is a new release, and I am in the mood to read a novella, and I was thinking it might be fun to read this when I'm on a night shift at work. Though it's not like hospital night shift creepy vibes, though maybe that would be a really perfect horror to read at work. So if you have any recommendations, let me know. But I'm hoping to read this at work when I do night shift in a day or so. And I'll tell you how it is, because I'm just excited to read a new release, short read for spooky season. The other books I have from that short that I filmed, I've got Rewitched by Lucy Jane Wood. This seems like a cozy fantasy, general fiction about a witch. Her powers are on the fritz, I think, and she's trying to, find her place in her coven type of a thing. So it seems like a nice cozy read. I've not heard a lot of people talk about it, but I've heard it come up a couple times, and so I think that this is on people's radar and would be really good to read now to let people know how I feel about it. The next book I want to read is A Perilous Undertaking by Deanna Raybourn. This is the second book in the Veronica Speedwell series, so it's a mystery series. It's set in like the 1880s, I think, so it's historical. She's a really spunky main character, and it's a very slow burn romance from what vibes I'm picking up. And I really enjoyed the first book, and I would love to read the second. I've also got a nonfiction. This is Witchcraft, a history in 13 trials. Different types of witch trials throughout the world and throughout history. I thought this would be really fascinating. I tried doing this on audiobook previously, and I felt like the amount of information I was getting, or like the way that the writing was maybe not clicking with my brain right away. So I think I might do tandem read audio and physical book, at least while I'm getting into it. And then when I kind of have my understanding established, I can switch to just audiobook on this. But I'm really excited to read this for spooky season. The next book on my list is Stephen King, You Like It Darker. This would be my first Stephen King. I've not read any of his work and I don't know where to start. But this is his newest release and it's a bunch of novellas, short stories. And I thought that this would be really fun to read in like small snippets and kind of spread it out throughout the month to read through these stories. And they seem really dark. I am a fan of like really dark horror. And so I think I might really like this. I don't know. Every time I've been worried that something might be too horror for me, I've really loved it. So I'm hoping that I love this too. And this will be a good start for Stephen King's stuff. I've got two romances next. This is Love and Other Conspiracies by Mallory Marlowe. And I haven't seen this author before, but this is a cryptid hunter and a cryptid skeptic who I think is filming the cryptid hunter or something like that. And so I thought this would be kind of a fun spooky read. I've got another spooky read, but this is an author I've read before, Jen DeLuca, who wrote the Well-Traveled series set in the Renaissance Fair, and I generally like her writing style, so I'm excited to read Haunted Ever After, another new release that is about this woman who moves to Boneyard Keys in Florida. Yeah, Boneyard Key, and it has a lot of spooky things going on, including house may be haunted, I think. So that should be really fun. I just wanted to have a couple of romances in the spooky realm so I could kind of compare and contrast and get different kinds of spooky experiences. And then this is a horror slash a thriller maybe. This is We Used to Live Here. It's a new release by Marcus Klewer. I don't know how to say that. But basically some people move into a house and then strangers visit and say, hey, we used to live here. Can we come in and like see how it's different or show you cool things about the house? And then they don't leave. So that gives me thriller vibes, but I've heard there's some really strong horror elements in this. There's also some really interesting mysterious Easter eggs throughout. And so I thought it would be really fun to have a physical copy so I could see visually more of those Easter eggs. There's also a book club for my local bookstore about this book. But I don't think I'll get to go because I think I'm working that day, which would be really sad. But maybe I can get my schedule switched around a little bit. The next book I have is a classic. This is Alice Hoffman's Practical Magic 25th Anniversary Edition. This is another like cozy witch womanhood type of a story, I think. I don't know if there's any kind of romance in it, but I think that this would be really fun to read because it is a classic for spooky season. I also have a couple mysteries. This is Death on the Nile by Agatha Christie, and I've yet to watch the new movie. It's not that new anymore, but I'm really behind on movies, and I would love to read the book before I watch the movie because we really enjoyed the movie so far, my husband and I. And I have read an Agatha Christie in the past. I read Halloween Party, and it was fine. It was okay. I'm hoping, giving another try, that I will like this one more, but we'll see if I do. And then finally on my October TBR, I have Everyone on This Train is a Suspect by Benjamin Stevenson. And same thing with the witchcraft nonfiction book. When I first started the audiobook a couple months ago, I just could not get into it because there's like a list of characters at the beginning and it was just hard to wrap my brain around all the information it was giving me. And so I decided that I would put this off. I think I will do a tandem physical and audio read for the first little bit while I establish myself with all the characters and then switch to audio when I feel comfortable with it. But I really enjoyed this author's first book. This is Benjamin Stevenson. That book was Everyone in My Family Has Killed Someone, and it was kind of mystery with some slapstick comedy thrown in because he's a comedian and some really interesting twists and turns. So it was a really good mystery. So I'm excited to read this next book in the series. We'll see how long this video actually ends up with all my cutting and splicing with the interruptions. I'm gonna go check on my daughter. She has been quietly reading upstairs, thankfully, for a little bit. But before you go, I would love if you enjoyed this video, if you would like and comment down below any of my TBR that you're interested in also reading, or if you've read any of these books that I have recently read. I would love to hear your ratings on them. And if you have any recommendations for me, because I read quite the variety. I'm always open to new books to put on my TBR. Thank you so much for being here. And if you want to see more from me, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell notification so you can be notified anytime I post a new video about books, yarn, and all sorts of cozy things. Until next time, happy reading. Bye!